Welcome back to Upgrade to General, a series to help you upgrade your amateur radio license to General class. And this is episode 3. We're going over the Commission's Rules, Group Question B. And I am Ron Call, KE7CR, your guide. Well, let's jump in and get started with question number 1. What is the maximum height above ground for an antenna structure not near a public use airport without requiring notification to the FAA and registration with the FCC? Basic answer is 200 feet. 200 feet is the limit, beyond which you have to get special permits for. Next question, with which of the following conditions must beacon stations comply? What is a beacon? What's a beacon station? A beacon station is a station that just transmits. The purpose is to try to help people understand propagation and receiving conditions. From the beginning of radio, one of the most important questions was, how good is my signal? Am I being heard? And so beacon stations were set up. Now, amateur radio beacon stations, the power limit is 100 watts, but other beacon stations exist. The National Institute of Standards and Technology of the federal government operates one of the oldest beacon stations, WWV from Boulder, Colorado, and also WWVH from Hawaii. And they transmit on known frequencies with known power levels. And there's the advantage. For example, WWV transmits with 10 kilowatts on 5 megahertz, 10 megahertz, 15 megahertz. Because you know the power level, you can listen to those frequencies and tell how good is the bands, how good is reception today. So that's the purpose of beacon stations. There's also an international beacon project where stations, ham radio stations from all over the world, transmit at known power levels. They start out with 100 watts, then go to 10 watts, then to 1 watt. And so by listening to those, you can estimate propagation conditions. Another interesting idea for beacons is what's called the reverse beacon network. Now this is just where people have receivers, ham radio receivers, just listening, and when they hear a call sign, they have computer software that skims those call signs off and posts them on the internet on the reverse beacon network site. So you can tell who was talking to who else. You can see in near real time what the propagation conditions are on various bands. One of the neat things to do is have the reverse beacon network page pulled up on the internet while you call CQ on the air and see if yourself is spotted, if you can see your own call sign, so you can tell who's hearing you. So these are all ideas for beacons. So back to the question, with which of the following conditions must beacon stations comply? The answer is no more than one beacon station may transmit in the same band from the same station location. So it's the idea of one beacon per band per location. That's the rule. Next question is, which of the following is a purpose of a beacon station as identified in the FCC rules? And the answer is observation of propagation and reception. Again, you're trying to figure out how good is the propagation conditions. Next question, which of the following transmissions is permitted for all amateur stations? You got to remember the idea behind this question is, what is the purpose of amateur radio? It's not for business. It's not for making money. It's not military. It's not for secret messages. In fact, it's illegal to try to encrypt messages. It needs to be open so that everybody can understand what the message is. So the purpose of amateur radio is for enjoyment. It's a hobby for personal enjoyment, for experimentation, for learning, for service. It's not for any of those other reasons. So the answer for permitted transmissions for all amateur stations is occasional retransmission of weather and propagation forecast information from U.S. government stations. The next question is, which of the following one-way transmissions are permitted? Amateur radio is usually supposed to be a two-way communication, you communicating with someone else. It's not a broadcast system. You're not just throwing a signal out there for anybody to listen to. That's why music is prohibited. That's why playing advertisements are prohibited. Okay, so it's usually a two-way system, but it is legal for transmissions to assist with learning the International Morse code. So that's the answer. For example, the ARRL transmits daily with Morse code practice, CW practice, at different speeds, so people can learn CW, and it's a great thing that they do. Next question. Under what conditions are state and local governments permitted to regulate amateur radio antenna structures? This question brings up some emotional issues with some hams lately. There are more and more homeowners associations, local governments that want to restrict antennas. Seems like people don't want a giant antenna in their neighborhood. But the federal government recognizes the importance of the amateur radio service for emergency communication when emergencies happen, for the service that hams do for their communities, and for training for communications and technical fields. And so the government wants to really support the amateur radio service as much as possible. So the idea is give as much freedom and leeway to hams as possible, unless there's some very important reason why they shouldn't have the antenna. So the answer to this question is amateur service communications must be reasonably accommodated, and regulations must constitute the minimum practical to accommodate a legitimate purpose of the state or local entity. So it can't just be, oh, we don't like the antenna, so you can't build one. It has to be, there's got to be a reason that it would cause a problem. They have to show that that's the minimum impact they can do, and they have to try to reasonably accommodate a ham that wants to put an antenna structure up. What are the restrictions on the use of abbreviations or procedural signals in the amateur service? Again, ham radio is not supposed to be encrypted, so if the abbreviations somehow confuse the meaning, if they're trying to hide the meaning of the message, then they can't be used. But people use abbreviations all the time. The purpose for abbreviations is to help speed up a communication and help make it clearer. So back in the early days of ham radio, when most of the communication was done with Morse code, it took time. So anything you could do to try to speed that up, so the hams came up with a lot of abbreviations. Some of these abbreviations are very commonly used in people texting or sending quick messages today, and some are very unique to hams. For example, CQ, the letters CQ, just means seek you. I want to talk to someone. Somebody answer me, please. So you're looking to make a contact on the radio. TU for thank you. OP or OP for operator's name. RST is a signal report, means readability, strength, tone. 73 means best wishes. GM for good morning, GE good evening. You know, we're used to these kind of abbreviations. BK for back to you, like you're turning the transmission back over to the other person. A YL you sometimes hear on the air, that's young lady. XYL, a wife. And OM, old man. So these are often used, especially in CW on Morse code. You'll see these from time to time. Also, there are what are called Q signals. These are specific abbreviations that start with the letter Q, that if you memorize some of these or have a chart that you can look them up quickly. I have a chart in my ham shack that somebody sends one I'm not familiar with, I can quickly look it up on the wall. You get used to these on the air after a while. For example, QRL, you might send that out. QRL with a question mark means, are you busy? Is this frequency in use? Now on voice you would just say, is the frequency in use if you're on single sideband. But on CW you would send QRL question mark. QRM means interference. Interference from another station. QRN is noise, like natural electrical noise, like from lightning strikes, storms. Sometimes you get electrical noise from power lines. Anything like that would be QRN. QRO is high power, QRP low power. QRS you might send to somebody to ask them to send slower. If they're sending CW and it's too fast, you could send QRS and they'll slow down. QRT means you're quitting. QRZ or QRZ is who is calling me. QSB, signal is fading. QSL, acknowledging the contact. In fact, a lot of hams, I love doing this, send QSL cards, postcards, after a contact to signify that they made the contact on the air, and these are called QSL cards. A QSO is a radio contact. So you hear people say thanks for the QSO or QSO. QSY means to change the frequency. Sometimes people ask for that because they want to copy you on another band, or maybe the frequency has some interference. And QTH is location. So Q signals, other abbreviations are used to speed things up and try to help maintain the understanding of what's going on. Now, to get to the answer to the question, what are the restrictions on the use of abbreviations or procedural signals in the amateur service? The answer is they may be used if they do not obscure the meaning of a message. Abbreviations are fine as long as they don't obscure the meaning of a message, because that would be like using some secret code to encode a message, and that's illegal in a ham service. Next question. When is it permissible to communicate with amateur stations in countries outside the areas administered by the Federal Communications Commission? Now the answer is when the contact is with amateurs in any country except those whose administrations have notified the ITU that they object to such communications. The ITU is the International Telecommunications Union. Now most countries have amateur radio operators, and radio signals don't recognize international boundaries, they just go across the earth. So as hams, it's fun to communicate with people from different countries, especially if you're using CW, it's an international language, and those contacts are perfectly legal, perfectly fine, except if those countries have said they don't want amateur radio contacts. Some countries make amateur radio illegal. Now at the current time, the only two I know of are Yemen and North Korea. All other countries allow amateur radio. Next question. On what HF frequencies are automatically controlled beacons permitted? Now, this is a little bit of a tricky question. You got to realize that automatic transmissions are more regulated. You got to be careful with those because a control operator is always supposed to be controlling the transmissions. There is a segment on the 10-meter band. So there's a series of 10-meter beacon stations. So the answer to this question is 28.20 megahertz to 28.30 megahertz. That's part of the 10-meter band. So remember, 10-meter band, it's okay for automatic beacons in those frequencies. Next question, what's the power limit for beacon stations? Again, the power limit is 100 watts, PEP output. Now what does this PEP mean? PEP stands for peak envelope power. So the idea is when a transmitter is transmitting, it's not always putting out 100% of the power that it could. Especially think about like single sideband voice transmissions. If you're talking, sometimes you're talking softer than others, and sometimes you're louder. And so it depends on the volume of your voice affects the amplification, and the final amplifier is going to amplify differently. Sometimes you stop talking, and so the power level will drop. The power level varies. So the power level that is counted as your maximum power is called the peak envelope power. It's the highest power level that the transmitter will transmit at. And modern transmitters are rated for their power levels. For example, I have a 100-watt transceiver. That means it's capable of putting out 100 watts PEP. Now that doesn't mean that it's 100 watts continuously. You're not at 100 watts all the time. The phrase for that, determining how much of the time you're at maximum power, is called the duty cycle. For example, CW or Morse code, when you send a dot, it transmits at full power, but then it's on a space and there's nothing being transmitted, so you're 0 watts. Then you might send a dash, it's at full power for a longer time, then maybe another space. And so for CW, the duty cycle is less than 100%. It might be, say, 60% of the time that it's actually transmitting. Some of the digital modes, like radio teletype and some of the other digital modes, FT8, when they transmit 100% of the time, so they're at 100% duty cycle. Those types of modes put a lot of strain on the transmitter. If you leave that on at full power too long, it could heat up those final amplifiers, and it can be bad on the radio. So you want to scale back the power output on those types of 100% duty cycle modes. Alright, so now that you know what PEP output means, the answer is 100 watts. PEP output for beacon stations is the limit. And the last question, who or what determines, quote, good engineering and good amateur practice, unquote, as applied to the operation of an amateur station in all respects not covered by the Part 97 rules? Again, Part 97 rules are the rules over the amateur radio service. And the idea with this question is, well, if it's not specified in the rules, who determines what is good practice? And the FCC. They determine what is good practice and good engineering. That's the end of this question set. Again, we're still working on sub-element G1, the Commission's rules. We have 3 more question sets on this section to go. Hope you got a lot out of this one. We'll see you on the next session. This is KE7CR 73.